Good morning. Can you hear me? No, it's not on. Yes. No. Hello? Can you hear me? Have we got mic? Yeah? Okay, gracias. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the GigaNet Annual Symposium 2016. It is, in fact, I believe, our 11th symposium, and we are officially 10 years old. My name is Marianne Franklin, and I am the chair of the GigaNet, and I'd like to welcome you here. We have some issues with people still waiting in line, so we've decided, in the interest of time, to begin. So our program chair, Daniel Opperman, will say a few brief words about the program today, and he will then be the moderator until our moderator, Alejandro Presantri, has managed to get here. So bear with us. It's only fair that we do begin on time. We have a very exciting program today. We have a lot of new papers, new faces, and some very established and senior scholars with us already in the room. So we're looking forward to learning a lot and having some good, fruitful discussion today. Daniel will now update you on how today will proceed. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Good morning, everybody, also from my side. It's very nice to see you here at the GigaNet Symposium. As Marianne said, we are still waiting for some more people to get in, but I can already say that the table is open for everybody. So if you want to sit on the side, you can sit on the side, but you can also join the table. It's so we are closer to each other, and maybe it could improve interaction later. So as you see, we have a printed program on the tables and on some of the chairs. So you can find out that we have 4 panels today. We're going to start in a few minutes with the first panel on participation, transparency, and responsibility. Our speakers are already here, and we're still waiting for the moderator, but we're starting already, so he's going to come in soon. After that, we're going to have a short break of a few minutes, and then we go on over to the second panel, which is on legal challenges, which is going to be a round table. So we're going to have a round table discussion. After that, we have a lunch break, which this year is quite extensive. We have like 90 minutes, or actually it was before it was like 2 hours, but we cut it down to 90 minutes, so we have more time for the afternoon session. So we start at 2:30 with our third panel on actors and policies in internet governance. Then we have another short break, and our final 4th session is on emerging economies and crisis. After that, we will have the final session, the business meeting, which is focusing on GigaNet as an organization, on our plans and what we want to do in the future. And we want to have your feedback as well on your experiences, on what you want to bring in, maybe how you could participate, or any suggestions are very welcome in this last session. And after this last session, we of course have a little party as well, the GigaNet reception. And on the program, you can find the address already. It's going to be in a restaurant called Milola, which is in Avenida Providencia. It is quite near the hotel Gran Fiesta Americana Guadalajara Country Club, which is the hotel where we had the other session yesterday. Some of you were there already, so you know it's the neighborhood. It's quite near that hotel. So yeah, let me welcome you, everybody here, and I would suggest we start now with our first panel. Oh, one comment?
I'm sorry, I forgot to say, our apologies in advance. If I have to leave briefly, I will be back. And if Daniel later has to leave briefly, he will be back. We have some GigaNet business in other rooms. So we're not deserting. We're not like we don't want to hear what you're saying. Just to apologize in advance if people are coming and going. And please join the table on the other side. It'd be great. Please come up and join the table. The table is open to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. So let's start with the first panel. We have Rachel Pollack, Isadora Hellegren, and Brandy Nonneke. So if you please could come here to you can sit here, yes. Yeah. And for the discussion later, it's important that if you want to participate in discussion, you can use the microphones. On every microphone there is this large button on the top. If you want to use the microphone, you press it, then you speak, and then you press it again to mute it. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Pollock, and I will be presenting today a paper titled Opening the Black Box in Search of Algorithmic Transparency. I'd like to first just preface this by saying some of you may know I work at UNESCO in my day job, but I'm here in an individual capacity as a member of ICANN's non-commercial users constituency, and the paper is based on my research conducted at the Oxford Internet Institute last year. So my talk will follow, I'll cover a few areas, first starting with some background and a brief review of the literature, and then discussing the research questions and methods that I used. I'll follow that with a discussion of my findings, including a quick actor mapping of positions, a discussion of the ideas and interests driving those positions, my conclusions related to the impact and the types of strategies that were used, and finally some recommendations and an indication of areas for future work. So why study the regulation of search engine algorithms? This is the intersection of two major areas in research and public policy debate. On the one hand, we have search engines, which have been written about extensively over the last 15 years, as they've been called the epicenter of the early web, as gateways to information and knowledge, and as new gatekeepers. There have been books about the search engine society and search as a database of intentions, giving insights into human behavior. At the same time, more recently, there's been increased interest in the role of algorithms in society. And algorithms, briefly, we can describe as a set of steps used in a process to solve some problem, usually by computers. That's a simple definition. There's been comparisons to a cooking recipe and the steps needed, but that's also seen as a bit oversimplified. But around this term of algorithms, there's been a lot of mystique developed. Some refer to it as the algorithmic turn in research, and especially concerning their opacity and proprietary algorithms. And so this has been pioneered by the work of Frank Pasquale about the black box society and the role of algorithms in areas such as search, reputation management, and finance. And so looking at these two areas, this is actually where search is the area where research has come the furthest in terms of algorithmic transparency, going back to the year 2000 and the work of Helen Nissenbaum and Introna, and the recognition that search is not neutral and that it has inherent biases in terms of the types of sites that it promotes and reinforcing existing hierarchies. So they called for transparency of search engine algorithms or their ranking algorithms. And since then, there have been other calls from Pasquale and others about how to increase algorithmic transparency in search. But on the other hand, there are significant challenges to that, and that includes that if algorithms are made transparent, then first it hurts the business model of search engine companies because that's their competitive advantage and their what's called often referred to as their secret sauce. And at the same time, it also could hurt the quality of search results because it opens up to spammers the risk of spammers gaming the system. So while there's been a lot of academic and theoretical discussion, to my knowledge, there have not been studies about how this has played out in practice in policy settings. And so that's what my research attempted to do. To give you just a few examples from the last few years of policy developments that could have an impact. In France, there's a new law on digital republic that includes sections related to a concept they call platform loyalty or platform fairness, which refers to both fairness towards consumers and also to other businesses. And also, it contains a provision of algorithmic transparency in public sector algorithms. There was a Senate amendment in France last spring, spring 2015, that was more closely related exactly to this question of algorithmic transparency in search that would have called for greater transparency. It was ultimately defeated, and I'll go into some of the reasons for that. At the European level, with a new general data protection regulation, there are provisions that some have interpreted as a new right to explanation, to receive an explanation of how automated decisions were made and the ability to challenge them. This also could have an impact. There are ongoing competition cases led by the European Commission about Google's practices. And then there have been some public statements made, most famously the recent statement by Angela Merkel about the role of search engine and social media algorithms and the need for them to be more transparent. So my key research questions were three parts. First, I asked how have key actors in Europe and North America positioned themselves on the question of transparency of search algorithms. I focused on Europe and North America because that's where these debates have gone the furthest. They also have strong traditions of regulations and economic policy and competition policy and data protection policy. So I focused on these two regions. Secondly, what underlying beliefs and interests can explain these positions? And finally, what strategies have the various actors used to advocate for their positions, and what impact have they had on the efforts for or against greater transparency on the regulation of search engine algorithms? So the methods that I used were qualitative. I conducted expert interviews with about 20 actors from across civil society, academia, tech companies, regulators, and intergovernmental bodies across Europe and North America. I also analyzed textual material from proposed legislation, governmental debates, and media coverage, and conducted a thematic analysis. So my findings I can sort of summarize following the three research questions. So first, to understand what positions actors have taken, so the major groups that I covered were civil society, Google, its industry competitors, and primarily in vertical search. And so Competitors in horizontal search would be considered as Bing or DuckDuckGo, and vertical search, those are in specific markets, such as shopping or price comparison sites. Then I looked at governments and intergovernmental organizations. And so I didn't try to capture the range of views within these actor groups, but rather those who have made statements or clearly taken positions, or who have had an interest on this question. And so what I found through this was that many different groups are talking about the need for transparency. But the reasons for it and what they mean by transparency often differ. And I actually was struck when reading Isadora's paper with the discourse analysis of cypherpunks, and you spoke about empty signifiers and that freedom was an empty signifier. And I think in this case, transparency is a bit of an empty signifier in the way that each of the groups refers to it. So for example, in parts of civil society, namely the group EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, they call for full transparency, essentially publishing the source code of the algorithms. Google talks a lot about transparency and points out its efforts, but those are more in terms of its transparency reports of requests that it receives for content takedown or user data. It also has a blog called Inside Search that talks about updates in very general terms. And so they say that they are transparent, but they don't mean in the way of actually publishing the algorithm. For some of the industry competitors, and namely there's a lobbying body called Fair Search that's made up of sites like Yelp and Expedia, TripAdvisor and Expedia, and they also talk about transparency, but similarly, they're not referring to transparency of actually publishing the algorithm, but rather transparency of Google's policies. In governments, again, it's not a full view, but from the proposed legislation, the Senate amendment actually would not have, again, required publishing the algorithm, but that was the way that it was portrayed in the media and the way that Google also wanted to present it, which I think led to its defeat. So to look now at the ideas and interests, 2 minutes. Oh wow, that's very slow. Okay, very quickly. Ideas and interests, greater transparency. The main areas were effects on fundamental rights, and so those were shared by civil society groups, European institutions, largely. There was also, especially in France, a fear of American technology giants and the role of Google, the fear of becoming a digital colony of US companies. Against greater transparency, there was a recognition of the importance of intellectual property, not only by Google, but also its competitors. And that actually, I saw, was why the competitors were also against algorithmic transparency, because it would apply to their own companies as well. And then there was wide recognition or agreement across the board that existing laws and regulations were sufficient, and that there was no need for a new law specific to algorithms, and both from the perspective of companies, but also those interested in human rights, who said that introducing a new law could actually weaken the position. So very quickly, lobbying strategies. I saw it was primarily lobbying with information and ideas, or informational lobbying of companies and organizations commissioning reports from experts to reinforce their existing positions. And I observed a very fragmented landscape of expertise, each referring to a different expert, a different university. So just in conclusion, my overall finding was that due to this confluence of interest between Google and its competitors, it seems very unlikely that there will be a legal requirement for search engine algorithmic transparency. It may happen in other areas, but I don't think that it will in search. And I based on this research, put forward a few recommendations, namely for some kind of qualified transparency, perhaps given to regulators or a self-regulatory body, but not publishing the full algorithms, to have more consumer choice and giving options about whether they want their data, their activity tracked on search, more education awareness raising, And that's where I will end. I would very much welcome your feedback, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I suggest we continue with the second and the third presentation. After that, we take questions for all three speakers. So the second presentation will be Isadora, or yeah?
Right. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about various approaches and aspects of issues of internet governance. My name is Isadora Hellegren. I work at McGill University, where I recently graduated, and I will be presenting my research that I did on what I call crypto-discourse. And it's... Sorry, did you hear what I was just saying? Okay. Should I repeat that, or...? Okay. Right. Well, I will be presenting my research that I did on crypto-discourse and its implications for our understanding of internet freedom. And to do that, I will begin with this brief story that happened rather recently that made many headlines. In February, the FBI and the multinational tech company Apple enter into this public dispute regarding access to data residing in a very specific iPhone. A court order required Apple to create software that would enable access to this iPhone to the protected content of the phone that belonged to the deceased San Bernardino mass shooter. But in response, Apple CEO Tim Cook, he published a customer letter publicly opposing the government's request. Instead of complying with the court order, Cook advocated for the need for strong encryption to protect personal information. And Apple's response to the court order quickly became a matter of discussion in many media outlets. For example, whistleblower Edward Snowden presented Apple as a privacy rights defender when he tweeted that the FBI is creating a world where citizens rely on Apple to defend their rights rather than the other way around. Law professor Yochai Benkler, on the other hand, he wrote in The Guardian that the legal conflict between Apple and the FBI is not even a question about security versus privacy. Instead, he meant that it's a conflict about legitimacy, and he pointed out a democratic deficit in the lack of trust in and accountability of the National Security Agency of the United States. And in a similar vein, Columbia cyber fellow Silberberg called attention to the wrongful representation of the request as one that actually concerned encryption software. He said that Apple's choice to publish a letter framing this issue as an encryption one is populism, plain and simple. But these statements are but a few examples of the many voices that compete in defining the meaning of this dispute concerning the law enforcement's ability to access personal data. What is relevant here is that the dispute reminded many technology reporters of a series of legal battles that took place in the early 1990s, namely the crypto wars, where online rights advocates such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the United States Department of Justice disputed the legal status of crypto in court. Crypto, I mean, is an empty signifier that serves as a battlefield in a larger discursive struggle to determine the meaning of internet freedom. So crypto is short for cryptography, and it refers to, in its particular meaning, to encryption software, such as Pretty Good Privacy or GNU Privacy Guard, GPG. And the design of this software aims to render the content of online communication illegible to any third party trying to access it. But crypto, or encryption software, does not have any inherent meaning in and of itself, and that which we can see in the change of legal status over time. It used to be classified as war material by the US government and by international treaties, which it is not today. And just last year, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression presented a multi-stakeholder report in which encryption was described as an essential tool for the protection of human rights online. So, drawing on Leclos and Mouffe's theory of discourse, I conceptualize crypto as an empty signifier, and discourses are the result of inherently political struggles to define meaning. Empty signifiers hold together discourses and are sites where we can see these struggles taking place. And crypto has taken on multiple possible meanings that are beyond the features of the specific technology. And this struggle does not only take place in courtrooms, but also in academic journals, conferences, online spaces, and in technology magazines. And efforts to shape the form and function of internet-specific technologies are not separate from attempts to construct meaning through them. Media representations of these technologies, practices, and their users shape understandings of the internet. Depictions of, for example, encryption software as a terrorist tool for communication, online file sharing as criminal activity associated with piracy, and hackers as villains stealing personal credit card information communicate what constitutes and what does not constitute desirable online behavior. So internet governance debates are therefore both about the technical architecture as well as what Donardis calls expressions of mediation over societal values such as security, individual liberty, innovation policy, and intellectual property rights related to this architecture. And negotiation of this meaning shapes the related policymaking. So we must therefore also try to understand how various stakeholders construct specific understandings of internet-specific technologies. So drawing on Leclos and Mouffe's theory of discourse, I decipher what I refer to as crypto discourse, a partially fixed construction of meaning that establish a relationship between crypto and a negative conception of internet freedom in relation to the state. At the core of this discourse, we find cypherpunks and technology journalists. The cypherpunks formed as a community when privacy-concerned and technology-interested individuals gathered on the electronic cypherpunk mailing list in 1992 to discuss and develop encryption software in order to protect their online privacy. Tech journalists, primarily associated with Wired magazine, popularized and perpetuated the work of the cypherpunks. And several events led up to the formation of the cypherpunk community, and others reinvigorated their discourse at later stages. So, I mapped key discursive events pertaining to the articulation of crypto in relation to freedom among interrelated discourse communities of cryptographers, hackers, online rights activists, and technology journalists during a period of 40 years. The timeline begins with academic journal articles from the cryptographic community of MIT and Stanford in a context where the US government had the upper hand in defining the meaning of crypto. And following the leak of the Pentagon Papers showing the role of the government in the Vietnam War, the US experienced a rising antagonism towards the state. And this is also a time of a rising counterculture where technology-interested members of the Whole Earth Network, primarily based in California, brought together communities of journalists, hackers, and entrepreneurs around the relation between the concepts of technology and freedom. And this is the origins of crypto discourse that set the stage for the crystallization. And during the early 1990s, the US government played an essential role in politicizing crypto advocates. Parallel to government efforts to establish a role between computer crime and encryption software, concerned computer users from the cryptographic community and the Whole Earth Network mobilized ideologically behind cryptography as a means to achieve political and societal change. So drawing on the social antagonism that was already there, the cypherpunks came together through this mailing list and wrote political manifestos that have circulated the internet and come to signify the practices of the entire movement. These manifestos define crypto as a productive force of its own, beyond human control, a future development that is inevitable. And this use of historical materialism excludes responsibility from social actors to determine its direction and use. Any attempts to hinder or regulate the development of crypto anarchy, in this case that they sought, is therefore, in this representation, meaningless. The timeline ends with the revitalization period, and this period is characterized by events such as the 9/11, a globalized anti-terrorism state discourse, and the harmonization of communication policy, along with the rise of new uses of encryption. By new uses, I mean the increased popularity of onion routing, such as the Tor network, mass leaks by WikiLeaks, and finally the Snowden leaks. And the specific strategies used to crystallize and popularize crypto discourse now appear in new contexts, where the meaning is extended to also include journalistic practices and whistleblowing on a global stage. And this new context also globalizes a social antagonism towards the state that originated in a very specific Anglo-American context. So, how does it function then, the crypto discourse? I mean that it removes responsibility from democratic states to secure online rights and freedoms, as it excludes other possible and positive meanings of internet freedom. Crypto discourse presupposes individuals' responsibility to protect themselves and their online communication through technological means from undue interference from state authorities or corporations. And this understanding does not emphasize the state's responsibility not to abuse its power in the form of mass or bulk surveillance of online communication, nor does this negative conception of internet freedom call for mechanisms that would hold the state accountable if it did abuse its power as a democratically elected government. And this process has not only taken place over time, but also over space, and it has traveled from a specific context to now encompass many of the world's governments through harmonization of policy. And this harmonization does not take into account differences in legal and political systems, such as varying perceptions of the meaning of privacy and the role of government. Like Jeanette Hoffman said yesterday, talking about internet freedom, what is censorship in the United States is not censorship in Germany. Right? And while strengthening individual rights to privacy, crypto advocates' discursive strategies may actually serve to undermine efforts to construct positive meanings of internet freedom. If the discursive struggle taking place in crypto is indeed overshadowing a governmental legitimacy crisis in the United States, then crypto discourse, as currently articulated by crypto advocates, could deepen such democratic deficit by further removing responsibility from government. And what is more, crypto discourse forwards a negative conception of freedom internationally by making individual privacy an individual rather than state responsibility. Future encryption policy should therefore seek to take into account national variations in perception of freedom and consider what should constitute desirable governmental responsibilities in a democracy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Isadora. And I'm happy that we have also here now Alejandro Pesanti, who is the moderator of this session and who made it through the registration. I guess there were a lot of people outside in the queue. So we're going to continue now with a third presentation, and after that we start with the discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. Alejandro Pesanti. Welcome to Mexico. Welcome to Mexico. Can you hear me? Welcome to Mexico. I have two words. One of them is very welcome. The other one is, remember, you are 1,500 meters above sea level. For the Europeans, remember that at 1,500 meters above sea level, you only have ski stations, no cities. So maybe you're not completely used to moving around at that altitude. It's the altitude of Denver, more or less, for the USians. And that said, welcome and thanks for, as you see, I believe in self-moderation so strongly that I actually trusted the session without.
Okay, is the mic on? Yeah, great. I can speak directly into the microphone. Well, good morning, and I would like to thank GigaNet for organizing today's events. I have organized many events, and I know you put in many hours, so thank you very much. And I think we will all benefit from today's meeting. Even looking around the room, I see many of my academic idols, so that's great. Hopefully I'll get to pull them to the side and have a discussion. So I'm Brandy Noneke. I'm a postdoc at the Center for IT Research in the Interest of Society, headquartered at UC Berkeley, but we also operate across 3 additional UC campuses out of the 10, UC Merced, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Davis. My collaborator, Dimitri Epstein, was not able to make it to today's event, but I think he's watching right now. So we'll see on Twitter if he has any comments about my presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about research we're doing on the ICANN strategy panel on multi-stakeholder innovation. I'm talking about crowdsourcing internet governance. So the work that Dima and I do, we look at how does the IGF function, and how do we look at multi-stakeholderism, and how do we define internet governance, and looking at the interconnections between these two. From their inception, and the legitimacy of the multi-stakeholder model has been questioned because some stakeholders in the forum may be able to carry more weight. So my dissertation research, which feeds into this research, looked at the impacts of the East Africa Internet Governance Forum on policy making in the region. So I'm certain all of you in this room know that the IGF is a non-binding forum. However, I've been able to identify with some of my research that the forums in the East Africa community, they actually influence actual policy. So then that begs the question, who's participating in those face-to-face forums and who has influence in those forums? And so we're expanding this idea to look at the influence of stakeholders within the face-to-face interactions of the Internet Governance Forum, but then also how can we use online tools to help create a more inclusive and equitable environment for stakeholders. Also, I think it's critical that when we discuss the Internet Governance Forum and other multi-stakeholder forums, we consider what we call the politics of participation. So who is invited to participate in those convenings, and not only who has a seat at the table, but who is speaking from that seat at the table, and how much influence do they have on setting the agenda and the discourse of the discussion and the outcome documents, because it could be that the outcome documents and the discussions held at that forum could actually influence the real world, which also brings up another concern of many within these forums. Well, what happens out of this? It's great to come together and discuss these issues, and it's critical to the process of defining what are the key issues and what viewpoints we should take. But we also need to consider, well, what's the what? What are we doing here, and what are the outcomes? So launched in September 2013, there is a strategy panel on multi-stakeholder innovation as ICANN goes through its transition to make it a more multi-stakeholder entity. And the goals of this multi-stakeholder strategy panel was to gather broad feedback on ways that ICANN could use tools and processes to make itself more legitimate. So what types of crowdsourcing or collaborative filtering or online collaboration tools could we use to make the process more equitable? In another side of my research, I studied how to build crowdsourcing systems for policymaking. And of course, all of you in this room know, when we make an algorithmic choice, that is a choice and it can bias, right? So the way that we present ideas to participants for them to rate ideas in the crowdsourcing model could bias participants giving a certain type of rating or response. So how can we try to the best of our ability to kind of build out or design out bias, although I think it's a very difficult thing to build out. So in the research question, we were looking at how do online tools such as the IdeaScale platform help to reify or challenge existing conceptions, hierarchies, and boundaries of community of practice and multi-stakeholder governance.
So the ICANN strategy panel actually deployed a crowdsourcing effort through the IdeaScale platform. Have any of you in this room heard of IdeaScale or used it? By show of hands. No one's heard of IdeaScale? Heard of it? How many of you participated in the ICANN IdeaScale implementation? Okay. I think that's a challenge that we have about inclusiveness of these systems, and so I will talk about that in a few slides. So when we're critiquing the design of these systems, we have to think about the structure of the system from a technical perspective, but also the social context in which that platform operates. And we decided to use Ida Marto and Landa Moore's 5 principles for crowdsourced policymaking. And those 5 principles are accountability. So does the system communicate back to the users the insights that are being gleaned from the system as the process is going on? You have people on there who are evaluating an idea. Is it communicating back to the people those choices from the group? Inclusiveness. Is the system easily usable by a large group of people, diverse people? Of course, here in the IGF, can all stakeholders participate in an equivalent way on the system? So by default, the system should be multilingual because our primary language is not just English. Is the system transparent? Is it communicating to the participant how it's making decisions about the ideas that are presented to participants for rating? Or let's say, for example, there's some sort of rating schema where you can rate positive up or down, negative, I do not support or I do support an idea. Is it communicating to the participant that ranking? And then also what I think is very critical to these systems is a modularity, because you shouldn't design a system of gathering feedback where you have to get on at the beginning and you can't enter ever again, right? Because many of the participants may find out midway through about something and they've missed the opportunity to give their feedback. So the system needs to be broken up into a modular format so that participants, when they find about it, they can go into the system or into this collaborative process and contribute in a meaningful way. And then synthesis. In all crowdsourcing systems, the goal is to have an end product that comes out of that deliberative process. And so how are you communicating that synthesis back to the participants? And I also should note that these 5 design principles do not just relate to the technical design of the system, how it looks, the user experience online, but also about the process. So are you communicating the modularity of the process to participants? Are you communicating beyond having someone have to look through the system to see whether or not you say how your algorithm is prioritizing ideas? Are you transparent about the process? So our initial research, we did qualitative document analysis off of transcripts of 5 ICANN meetings from the panel, a multi-stakeholder from ICANN. And then we also evaluated their final report in the supplemental materials of the strategy panel, the blog posts that were published by the organizers, which were published on the GovLab blog, and then the archived IdeaScale platform itself. So here's a screenshot of the ICANN strategy panel multi-stakeholder innovation crowdsourcing. So this is IdeaScale. And as you can see, there are ideas on here. So participants were asked to put forward an idea for how ICANN could strengthen its inclusiveness and multi-stakeholder processes and how it could become more legitimate. So participants were able to put in their idea. You can see that other participants could go in and boost up the idea, vote it up or vote it down, and they could also go in and actually dig in and comment on an idea. So the IdeaScale implementation had 3 stages. So in the first stage, it's this online idea solicitation via the IdeaScale system. There were 89 participants. 20 proposals were submitted to the IdeaScale system, of which they received 46 comments and 72 votes. After this first stage, the panel went forward with in-depth public evaluation of those proposals, And then they also did an internal evaluation and critique of those proposals, refined them, and gathered expert feedback. And then they also had a collaborative drafting and editing of proposals on the GovLab blog. So as you can see, this process was meant to be very inclusive and very transparent and a very modular format. So I quickly put this together to show the 5 design principles and then evaluating this idea scale implementation on process and platform. So the process itself was very accountable. There's a lot of reporting on the process itself. However, on the platform, it wasn't clear. On the idea scale platform, it wasn't clear how ideas were first generated into the idea scale system. So who decided to put those ideas in? Was there a vetting process? And then on inclusiveness, the process itself, as somebody who also does crowdsourcing in policymaking, it can be incredibly difficult to get a lot of participants, or you get one type of participant, a group or a sector that's very interested in that specific issue. And it can be a challenge to try to open that up to make sure that you get the diverse perspectives that you need in order to have a more informed process. And also the platform itself, the idea scale system, was only in English, which does prohibit participants from entering their suggestions into the system. Overall, the process was incredibly transparent, which is lucky for me as a researcher. There's everything written up that I would need to do my research. But the platform itself, it doesn't really discuss how the voting mechanism happens. There's an upvote and a downvote and some comments, and there's actually a leaderboard. So as I said before, there's this idea of politics of participation. So when you have somebody who has greater influence, or they're higher up on the leaderboard, now are they going to influence the discourse, and you have a winner takes all, which is the worst thing to happen, I think, in a crowdsourcing system. The process and the platform were both incredibly modular. Everything was broken up. And then the synthesis of how the ideas came, the final proposals, it was very clear, and the platform also showed this. So we believe item order and Landemorse design principles are very useful for evaluating the process and the platform design. But we are looking now to extend this for our paper and really come with more of a socio-technical lens to look at, yes, let's evaluate the platform, let's also evaluate the process, and let's contextualize this within internet governance processes. So we're going to be doing interviews with the organizers of the ICANN idea scale implementation and surveys to evaluate perceptions of multi-stakeholderism. Put that in before doing
Alejandro Pisanti at the microphone. I'm apologizing for having started late in my participation in this session. I think that we should open for questions. How much time do we have? We have 45 minutes. Maybe some people will be glad if we make it 30, but if the discussion is ripe, then we'll just go on. So I don't know. Yes. We believe in remote participation, in using the internet to make these meetings actually really open and diminish the barriers of cost and difficulty of travel. So we will be very emphatic in listening very carefully to questions from the remote or distance participants first. And of course, since some of them take a little bit of time to set up in a way that they can speak, we'll be making several rounds of asking for remote participation. But again, I think there's a remote moderator present. Do you have something? The remote questions are being sorted by the remote moderator, so we will start with a question or comment from inside the room, I think we should first start with brief and pointed questions, and as we see that time allows for more participation, then allow for longer participations in the discussion if all panelists agree as well. So first, questions here locally in the room. And if your beliefs allow it, your belief system allow it, it's very glad. We're waiting for some sound outside. That was not us. So if your belief system allows, we would be very glad for you to introduce yourself. It facilitates the record and for people who are not in the room to know who is speaking. But we understand that some people will want to remain anonymous.
This is Hans Klein. I'm from the Georgia Institute of Technology, School of Public Policy. I have a question for the first speaker about the algorithmic transparency. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission held hearings about a year or two ago where they considered an antitrust action against Google, and they didn't frame it in terms of algorithmic transparency, but essentially it dealt with some of the issues that you were talking about as well, which is the ability to the search results and using the search results to screen out competitors. So I just wanted to ask you, has that issue come up? I don't think you mentioned an antitrust perspective on algorithmic transparency, but it did seem to figure quite prominently in the US policy arena.
So actually in the paper, the mic.
Sorry, for the sake of the remote participants, it is very desirable that you identify yourself every time you take the microphone, please.
This is Rachel Pollack, and I presented the first paper on algorithmic transparency in search. And so the antitrust perspective, I alluded to a little bit, out of time, in terms of the European context with the competition case and the views of some of Google's, what I called industry competitors in vertical search. In the US, indeed, the Federal Trade Commission did consider a case against Google and ultimately decided against pursuing it. But the Wall Street Journal reported they received some of the side documents, and they found that Google's conduct has resulted and will result in real harm to consumers and to innovation in the online search and advertising markets. So that's something clearly that has been a focus. For the moment, it's only been being pursued in Europe. But based on reports of the FTC and the FCC, I think, again, algorithmic transparency is related in the sense of being one tool that could ensure the neutrality or fair business practices of Google services, but I don't think that that's ultimately what they would require. That they've also worked on, I think they have an Office of Technology Research and Investigation that launched in March 2015 that started to look at algorithmic transparency as one area of work. But from what I've seen so far, they clarify that that doesn't mean, again, publishing the algorithm, but it is an area of interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. And there was another speaker beside Hans. And
Hi, Nick Sozor from QT School of Law. My question was for Isadora, and thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed all of the presentations. Towards the end of your paper, you touch on some of the normative implications a little bit, and you spoke a little bit about this, but I was hoping you could expand a bit on this point that you argue that the construction of negative liberty can ultimately be harmful to more positive steps by nation states to protect freedoms. And I was just wondering whether you could reflect a little bit more and just expand on your point there, maybe in the, thanks.
So yes, can you hear me? Yeah, all right. So I'm Isadora that presented the CRYPTO-DISCOURSE presentation. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, this is much that I try to elaborate in my actual thesis. It's hard to fit it all into a paper and in a presentation. But I do believe that there are many different variations of our understanding of freedom. And I am from Scandinavia myself, I'm from Sweden. And believe the understanding of freedom there is very different from this more negative understanding of freedom, and in other countries too. And I believe that there are many different variations of what role we think that the state should have. And by uniting many different political, differentiating political objectives, left and right, that all go against the state, I believe that it removes this responsibility that the state should have, perhaps, in protecting these online rights by saying that, well, we cannot trust you anyways, so it's our responsibility to protect ourselves. So then there is nothing left that would hold the state accountable. So that's what I mean, that there are many different understandings of freedom, and by forwarding this discourse, by calling it all internet freedom on an international level, could be harmful for other attempts to construct alternative internet freedoms. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but I'd love to read the entire thesis. It sounds fascinating.
Okay, thank you.
Let's ask for the remote participation, please, if you have anything already. Remote moderators telling us that the user that looked like was going to ask a question has logged out, so we'll wait for that. And we'll come back to the room if there are other questions. Sorry, yes. Hi.
Hello? Yes. Hi, lovely panel, very informative, all of you. Isadora, I was wondering...
Name.
Oh, sorry, Marianne Franklin, GigaNet. I was wondering, Isadora, could you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by empty container term? Empty signifier, because there is one school of thought that would argue that no signifier can be empty, that by virtue of being empty, it's signifying something.
So what I mean by empty signifier, it's really more of a process than a state. So any signifier holding several meanings, or so going from a particular meaning, it's the process of emptying this particular meaning by filling it with so many meanings that the specific meaning becomes meaningless. It becomes so big that it manages to encompass so many different perspectives, or so many different approaches. That's why I mean that the empty signifier, crypto, can encompass left and right. There are crypto-anarchists, there are libertarians, there are left-wing pacifists that also believe or stand behind crypto. Although they do not have the same political objectives, they unite in this particular objective of the social antagonism. So the empty signifier is really where the struggle takes place. Therefore, it becomes empty because there's so much meaning being filled in it. Does that make sense? So it's the process of emptying it and filling it. No? Yes. Okay, you seem hesitant.
Yes, I understand what you mean entirely. It's just that when we say empty, we imply devoid of meaning. And in fact, your argument is saying it's over-determined and over an abundance of competing meanings. So the term empty, I think in that sense you mean ironically rather than literally. So I'm just fascinated with, perhaps you might want to elaborate that conceptually more.
Right. Right, meaning that it does not mean anything in the end, but there are all these meanings. I'm sorry.
Yes, everyone, this is great to have at GigaNet, because meaning is in fact the politics that we're dealing with. Could you perhaps consider that the meanings that are there are competing and contradictory meanings?
Yes.
So therefore, the whole issue is this competition and contestation,
yes.
rather than there is only one meaning.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is, so perhaps the terminology empty is not quite, I know it's coming from other discussions, but But meanings are always contested, so all signifiers are containers for something. And so what is interesting in your argument, and I take your point, is that it's exactly this, this overabundance of competing understandings of freedom that we need to be unpacking, rather than seeing that in itself as a problem. The real problem is that there's an assumption that there is only one meaning of internet freedom, and the struggle is to assert that one meaning over all others. So the container is in fact overflowing with many competing meanings. That's how I understand your work, but thank you very much. It was very useful.
Alejandro Pisanti, I will use my moderator's privilege if it's not taken away from me, from my dead cold fingers. I mean, to mediate in this very important discussion between Marianne and, sorry, Isadora, I was going to call you Eleanor, and Isadora. I mean, from a much more pedestrian point of view, I would say, if you can't know what it means, it has become meaningless. Whether because it's meaningless in itself, because I mean, it doesn't parse into the English language, or because you have to ask for so many more specifications. Like what you mean freedom, like in the First Amendment of the United States, before the church, for freedom of speech, and so forth. And I would ask for other participations, and I would have a question for each of the participants, of the panelists. So are there other participations? First, again, to the remote moderator, do you have any questions there? Here in the room, do we have questions? Then I will make them serially, I mean, in one set, and hope that sparks a conversation as well, if you agree, Daniel. First to Rachel. You pronounce your name Rachel? Right. To Rachel, I find all three papers, by the way, extremely interesting, very valuable. I come from the technical community side, but I'm a sort of bridge person in many ways. So one question, since you have held so many interviews, maybe it could be a salient point, even if you haven't been quantitative about it. But do people who have experience coding react differently as a group to the concept of algorithmic transparency? Do you see more coders saying that's a pipe dream, not achievable, not a desirable goal, not a useful thing to do as a class, let's say as a group? Have you at least seen a hint of that in your data? To Isadora, I think there's a deeper comment that is sparked very much by Marianne's question, which is, when we analyze spam, one of the things we say is that one man's spam is another man's caviar. As you know, what some persons find a worthless message, other people will actually kill for to get it. That's one of the difficulties with spam, by the way, because you cannot filter in any absolute sense, call something undesirable. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that one man's rights is another, or one person's, one human's right is another human's threat. So in some conditions, the concept of freedom from one culture may be seen as deeply threatening by another. Do you observe some of that when you look at the crypto discourse? People are actually asking for the state, and you mentioned this very carefully. You use words which in my very naive approach to political science are social contract wording. And you are speaking about different social contracts with different responsibilities of the state. Does this very pedestrian way of describing it fit with your paper? Could you elaborate a little bit? And to Brandy, I was close to the process. I had already left the ICANN board by the time this these strategy panels were set up. I was a participant, I was a member of the strategy panel on the role of ICANN in the internet governance ecosystem. So I followed the works of the other panels somewhat closely. And I found it very striking that there was very little participation or very, let's say, limited reaction to the innovative approaches strategy panel, which was led by Beth Novak, which is where the one you described, the work you described stems from. Do you see anything like a generation gap or a sort of culture gap? I mean, let's say people that are more hipsterish, younger, more connected to technology, what have you, react more and participate more in processes like IDEA? Or is it just a language issue, like you also mentioned, that being in English, it could just not attract enough people who don't speak English? And my second comment to you, asking for your reaction, is that as you mentioned that in your introduction, the IGF processes, or let's say the processes called IGF in countries and regions are more executive and decision-oriented. And do you feel that that's a threat for the concept of open deliberation that we insist on keeping in the global IGF, or can we manage and articulate both kinds of orientations? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the question. This is Rachel Pollack, for the record. So I think that you raise a good point that those with more technical knowledge or experience tend to be a bit more skeptical about the idea of algorithmic transparency. There was a paper written by some computer scientists together with legal scholars in the US that argued that algorithmic transparency is neither necessary nor sufficient to ensure fairness, because there are alternative techniques that can be used, technical techniques, but also because of the complexity of the code, and particularly when these algorithms are constantly changing with new inputs and personalized for users, and so that would be technically very difficult to implement. But I think it's not a universal consensus. There are some computer scientists who advocate for algorithmic transparency, and even offer to offer their technical skills in order to build open source open algorithms and open search engines. So I think there's not consensus, but in general, that's true that those with more technical expertise are a bit more skeptical.
Right. So first of all, everyone unites behind the idea of freedom. Everyone wants freedom. So it's very hard to oppose the idea of freedom, especially when we're talking about liberal democratic states as we know them. What I talk about mostly is the strategies used that are related to this idea of freedom. So in the concept of negative freedom, the strategies to enhance, promote, popularize the responsibility of the individual protection as an individual responsibility, as I said, removes and excludes the state. But if we talk about an alternative, if we look at Iceland, for example, and the International Modern Media Initiative created by Pirate Party representatives, they use a different approach, and they still belong to the same, we could call, crypto community in many ways. These people know each other, work together, and do not necessarily have opposing views, although they might in certain issues as well. It's a different context, it's a different form of freedom, and the International Modern Media Initiative tried to protect the ideas of freedom of expression and privacy by reforming laws, by using laws from other countries that are especially strong in regards to these questions. So it's a different strategy. So it's really the strategies I've been looking at when it comes to this, and that's when, in terms of your question, if there's a culture perhaps feeling threatened by other ideas of freedom in other cultures. I'm not sure about the threatening part, but I believe that there are different strategies that we can use to try to enhance our freedoms in that sense.
Thank you. Okay. I'm Brandy Noneke from UC Berkeley. Thank you for your questions. The first question was the limited participation. I think one of the main issues for most of us, the way that we operate, is that when we want to get things done, we go meet with the person face to face. So we have these ingrained behaviors of how we believe we can influence. And so I think changing that idea of how you can influence organizations or have your voice heard. And I think that is definitely changing.
Sorry, Alejandro Pisanti, the sound we heard is an announcement inviting people to go to the main session, to the main room for the messages of welcome.
Thank you. I think, and I do think that the hesitation is valid because some of these tools could do more harm than good if those tools end up influencing actual processes and outcomes. So I think it's a careful balance between reliance on interaction in traditional ways, so through our normal institutions of moving policy forward and even discourse, but also trying to build out these tools in a way that mitigate bias and are more equitable. And I think this is going to transition over time. And then the second question was on what are the risks of having an action-oriented internet governance forum like I've witnessed in the East African community, and does this pose a threat to open deliberation? I do think in part it does, because that forum has now become almost a secondary channel for stakeholders that are usually engaging with each other, so government and private sector. This is yet another channel for them to interact with each other and set policy initiatives. But I think calling it out and knowing that it's happening is critical in order for other stakeholders to be able to go in and have an influence on that discourse and the outcome documents. And I would also like to see not only the face-to-face interactions, engaging all stakeholders, but seeing how we can use these crowdsourcing tools to help level the playing field for all stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions or discussion points? From the remote, anything? So we don't have anything from the remote. We don't seem to have any more questions locally. I think that both the presentations and the discussion after that have been enriched very much the announced content. And I don't know, Danielle, if we should just call the session closed.
Wait, can I make one comment?
The threat of closing brings the question.
Yeah, I don't have a question, I have a comment. So typically when I'm at conferences or in meetings, I'm the only woman in the room. And I'm very excited to see many women in the room, and then also that my panel was 2 other women. So I'm very happy for that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro Pisanti at the microphone. This is indeed a trend that's been growing in the IGF. The IGF has usually had let's say, coming from technical conferences, you would say it has an atypically high participation by women, but still, of course, a ways to go. So if everybody else allows us, then we will call this session closed. Thank the speakers, both for their papers and for their responses and replies to the questions and comments, and wish you everybody a very good day and a good stay in Mexico. Thank you. Any message from the chair?
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Daniel Opperman for the record. Thank you very much, Alejandro, and thank you very much for all the presentations and the questions. We're going to close this session now, and we're going to have a 15 minutes break. And after that, we continue with the second panel on legal challenges. And there's still room here on the table, so people who are sitting in the back and who would like to sit on the table, please feel free to join the table. Thank you.
super perros de que el inglés, no manches, dije, wow. ¿No te dijo nada ahorita, Michelle? Sí vi que te sentaste y yo de que, oh, yo quiero hacer eso. Pero me iba a sentar y luego llegaron unos y se sentaron atrás. Y pues ni cómo sentarme enfrente, ¿sabes? De que contarme eso. Y yo de, no manches. Pues ahorita se separan y están platicando y sea la última. ¿Qué se escucha, no? No sé qué va. Están interesantes, pero como que
Buenos días a todos y todas. Good morning, everyone. So we will start the next panel regarding the legal challenges. In this panel, it's connected with the first one. And we have 4 presenters, and we will follow the list. So I'm glad to moderate this panel. I'd like to thank the organizers and especially my dear friend Daniel Opperman for the invitation. And well, the idea is to have one short presentation, about 10 minutes, for each paper, and then we open for the discussions, for questions. We have remote participation as well. Let's do it. Please, Marcos, you have the floor.
So, thanks very much for the invitation. I hope it's, I can do, maybe it's better. Thanks so much. Seems to be better this way. Thank you, Cher. Thanks for the invitation. And what we want to do is to present a project outline doing governance in figurations, constructing normative structures inside and outside intermediary organizations. So this project does not stand alone. It's part of a figuration as well, a bunch of researchers that want to study completely different social domains and the construction of social reality with the same theoretical background and the same analytical framework. And our aim is to better understand how governance structures or normative structures evolve, and want to apply these concepts that Marcos will explain in a couple of minutes as well. Our starting point is that we try and analyze phenomenons like the normative structure that has evolved after the right to be forgotten decision by the European Court of Justice, that has dramatically changed the way in which at least specific norms have been constructed. We now see that inside from intermediary organizations, norms evolve that formerly have been part of other spheres, that have been constructed with the help of other actors, and we are interested in how that works, how that interplays with the normative structures outside of organizations. And this case, this search engine case is a very good case study for us because here the difference between constructing norms inside organizations and outside organizations and the interplay between both is very specific, and you find very few examples of this kind of norm production elsewhere. And how we want to do that, will Marcos explain.
So there was a little bit confusion. My name is Markus Irman, that's Wolfgang Schulz, so for everybody who's reading, there was a twist in the name. So, okay, to the concept. Our main research question is how the normative structures are constructed. So we take a social constructivist starting point, and we ask ourselves, okay, how could we do this governance research analysis based on that what we already found in the governance literature. And we see there that governance is already developed as a counter-concept to hierarchical control and taking governance factors of different kind into account. We differentiate between laws and contracts, social norms, and also technological code. And all these factors together are combined in governance models today. So this is what we already have in governance research. Names change from time to time, but yeah, we have this structural view. Also, we have this view on multi-stakeholder formations and so on. But there are some shortcomings still left in our point of view. From our point of view, governance research today is still biased towards understanding structures without taking the process perspective into account. Research on organizational governance is focused on structural changes and their management inside organizations, so business organizations, so to say. And these studies ignore the environment of the organizations for most of the times. And from our point of view, research on internet governance especially is focused on multi-stakeholder governance structures and treats organizations as monolithic structures and doesn't have the inside view on organizations, especially on business organizations. So we try to overcome those shortcomings by developing a figurative take on governance. This concept is based on process sociology developed by Norbert Elias and further developed in the last years by authors like Coltree, Hepp, and Hasebrink. And they say, okay, the governance structures are constructed, and they are constructed by actors. And these actors form together figurations. And we now try to look on the processes going on in these actor figurations. They are characterized by three main criteria. So it's the actor constellation, the communicative practices going on between the actors. So our standpoint is that communication is the main mode how governance structures are constructed. And on the frame of relevance, so to say, the thematic framework that binds these actors together. So we have actors like Google Inc., the European Court of Justice, let's say some civil rights organizations, and they all together construct the normative structures that are relevant when it comes to the thematic frame of the right to be forgotten, so to say. So that's our main, let's say, framework, and this provides us two methodological points of entrance to the field, so we can analyze the materializations of the factors, the laws, the contracts, the terms of services. There's a close connection to the paper of Nick in this point. And we also can do a process analysis. And this process analysis could be done by interviews and can also be done by field work of ethnographers going to the organizations and looking at the actual processes going on inside these organizations like the European Court of Justice and in our research inside the business organizations. So Wolfgang will point on that now a little bit further.
Thanks. So it's me, Wolfgang, again. Now coming back to the case of the right to be forgotten. As you could see from Marcos' talk, we have two structures that we are looking at. One is the traditional Larry Lessig-based four-factor model of internet governance, and we apply that as well. But what we add to that is that we look for each factor and the interaction of the factors to our figurational three-level model. So we analyze empirically what actors are involved inside of the organization and outside of the organization, and how they interact, how they communicate, what communication media they use. The second thing is that we want to analyze what the analytical frame actually is under which they operate. Do they operate under the assumption that we have to create a right to be forgotten? Then that would be the frame of reference that is relevant to us, and we would see that the norm making is structured under these umbrella. And the last thing is that we want to identify specific practices of norm making. We want, for example, to see how inside a search engine organization these norms are formed. We know that will not be easy empirically. Our dream is to have someone inside to ethnographically working on that and seeing how a conflict is processed when there is a new case coming in, and how the new norms to decide on these kind of conflicts are evolving in the organization. So that's basically what we want to do. If everything works out, then in this group of researchers, we have the chance to compare that to other norm-making procedures. For example, there is one colleague working on religious authority and the construction of religious authority. I don't say that intermediaries are churches, but there might be some similarities as regards norm-making in different social domains. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia. I come from Syracuse University. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to present in my work related to the implications of the application of the hot pursuit principle and mechanism of the Law of the Sea Convention into the cyberspace. Is it better? Everybody can hear me? Is it better now? Can everybody hear me better? Okay. Okay. So I will start my presentation by acknowledging a fact that probably everybody here knows, which is that in today's world, there's no treaty that regulates the internet or the cyberspace. Although the multi-stakeholder model has been successful in keeping the internet free of a unique point of control, there are still nation states and individuals who advocate for a government-based model. This scenario was clear during the ICANN transition debate, when some nation states argue in favor of a regime managed by the ITU. But the first question I came out to when realizing the situation is, why these different of opinions exist? Well, I believe it is because nation states have different conceptions over what should be the governance model for a resource beyond the traditional border of their own territories. In concrete, when it's about the cyberspace, academics and non-academics, mostly military, have called to apply similar policies to the ones contained in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS, into the cyberspace. What reasons are they giving is the next question that I ask myself. Well, first of all, they argue that the sea was once an unregulated space beyond nation states' traditional borders. The sea is also a space for war, economic production, and communication, and is constantly subject to sovereignty claims, pretty much as the cyberspace today. As an example, in June 2016, that's pretty much 6 months ago, NATO announced that the 28-member alliance agreed to declare cyber an operational domain, just like the air, the sea, and the land. In the United States, you find very often the military referring as the cyberspace as the fifth element, and they talk about sea power to cyber power. But the question now is, what is behind of a potential regulation based in UNCLOS? Why is so constantly defended by nation states so different, such as well-established democracies, hybrids, or authoritarian regimes? Well, the first thing to say about UNCLOS is that it's a multilateral treaty, a UN treaty, that covers multiple aspects of the regulations of the spaces and activities in the ocean. I'm going to ask you to please look at the map. I'm sorry. Okay, to look at the map that you see up in the PowerPoint. I know it's very confusing, but that's the distribution created by UNCLOS. The idea, the main characteristic of UNCLOS, is the creation of fictional spaces where nation states keep specific sovereignty rights for them. The idea is that coastal states' sovereignty decreases with increasing distance of the coast. The end of this sovereignty claim is either the high seas, an area that belongs to anybody, or another nation state territorial waters. This policy is known as maritime jurisdiction. I, on the other side, call it a virtual fragmentation of the ocean. Taking a new term by the academics, we can call it a virtual alignment of the ocean. The hot pursuit principle, a mechanism to fight against illegal activities in the sea, is an element of UNCLOS, and in that way was built on the basis of the absolute respect of nation states' sea sovereignty rights. So, trying to make a similar or a potential comparisons, I argue that the potential implications of applying UNCLOS into the cyberspace include, number one, a call for the inclusion of nation-state sovereignty and jurisdiction. In other words, bits are under a nation-state jurisdiction. When controversies occur, so far, leading cases agree with the absolute respect to the nation-state sovereignty. We can see a very clear case, as I argue, in the conflict between Microsoft and the US government, also known as the Irish case. Number three, although the cyberspace we know is invisible and cannot be felt in any way, the application of UNCLOS may have practical implications that manifest in a potential fragmentation of the internet infrastructure. And finally, and I think this is, from my point of view, the most important and dangerous implication, is that by having solo actors to nation states, the application of UNCLOS into the cyberspace has as a consequence the creation of a potential model opposed to the multi-stakeholder model that, for good or for bad, criticized as much as it can be, is the one that has allowed us to enjoy a free and open internet as we have become to know. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everyone. I think I'm getting a signal to move across a little bit because I can't actually see most of the table or the cameras. My name's Nick Suzor. I'm an associate professor at Queensland University of Technology School of Law. Do you mind if we squish over a little bit more? Can I move this back? Thank you. Or we could change seats. How's that? All right, thank you. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so my name's Nick Suzor, and my project is about legitimacy, specifically my conceptualization of what I call digital constitutionalism, a term that's used in slightly different contexts by different people. But the core point I want to make today is that we need better theory to start to understand what legitimacy means in these private governance systems. And this is actually a conversation that's really difficult to have. It's a conversation that's quite topical at the moment, particularly when you look at the increasing power of private online intermediaries, platforms, in governing the behavior of users. And so what I think is missing fundamentally from this discourse is a way to articulate what legitimacy means and what sort of standards of legitimacy we might expect from private actors. And the key here is I don't want to suggest that the standards to which private actors ought to be held is the same standard that we hold nation states in public systems of governance. But I do think that those values help us to particularize the issues that arise so that we can start to add some rigor and some clarity to the discussions about the things we care about when governance is done online by private actors. So that's the general gist. The first point, I guess, is probably to clarify what I mean when we talk about governance. And by governance, I mean to understand it in a very broad sense, in the sense of the management of the course of events in a social system. And so the task there for regulatory scholars is, if we recognize that governance is decentralized, to then come up with a set of indicators and a theory, a framework to understand what legitimacy might mean in a decentralized system. And legitimacy also has multiple meanings. One component of legitimacy is a descriptive component, that the people who are doing the governing are accepted as having a right to govern in the way that they do. I'm more concerned here with the normative component of legitimacy, the set of contested political standards against which we judge the exercise of power. So this then is my project of digital constitutionalism, which is particularly to start to articulate what limits on the exercise of private power we might like to see in decentralized systems. This is about the formation of a polity and the rules for how governance is done. Constitutionalism here in the sense of a group of people who are bound together and thinking about the constitution, the way in which those groups are governed and organized and set up. Okay, so the short version of the paper is that I think that the values of the rule of law, particularly the procedural values of the rule of law, can really help to start to articulate some of these questions. And by that I mean, the rule of law is the basic concept that those who exercise power over our lives, governance power, must exercise it in a way that is equal, certain, and fair. And that's the core liberal set of values of the rule of law that are often treated, primarily by liberal scholars, as universal. But it is and that universalization has a certain claim, that it, at least in some concepts, some concept of consent of the governed, I guess, is probably universal in systems of governance as a core standard of legitimacy. So in the paper, I present this framework, and I'm happy to talk about more in questions or after this session, but basically articulating 3 different buckets of concerns of things that we might care about in terms of procedural legitimacy. The first is meaningful consent, that rules are clear, that there is genuine consultation on changes, that there are real opportunities to exit systems. The second is about equality and predictability, that decisions are not arbitrary, that rules are fairly and equally enforced, and that rules are stable enough to guide behavior. And the third is about due process, that there are reasons available upon which decisions are made, that participants have some access to some avenue of appeal and independent review. So again, to be clear, I don't think, and I don't want to suggest, that we ought to hold platforms and businesses exercising governance power to the full high standards of legitimacy that we expect from nation states. But I do think that by particularizing these values, we can provide a language to start to articulate some of the tensions that we're seeing in a way that is a little bit clearer, in a way that helps us advance a political process. This is really a highly contested area. We don't have agreements about the standards to which, in my case, platforms ought to be held. And it's not easy within this system of private governance to talk in a language of rights when rights are traditionally applied mainly against public state actors. So by using this language, I hope to be able to add at least a shared understanding of what is at stake, even if we disagree on the implications of that analysis. The empirical work in the paper focuses mainly on the formal terms of service documents of social media platforms, looking at this stage just at the legal documents. On that level, the spoiler is that judged against these values, contractual terms of service are actually really poor constitutional documents. The next step, though, is really to start studying governance in practice, which is why I'm really happy to be on this panel. The work done by Marcus and Wolfgang in this paper, I think is the key to how we need to start to understand what is going on. One of the challenges, the big challenges in talking about legitimacy and governance in this space that you pointed out, is that we don't actually know a whole lot about how private platforms make decisions. Most of what we know is based on anecdotes and leaked informations and a few investigative journalists who've been able to get access, and then the public documentation that these different private actors submit to public processes and make available online. Studying governance in practice, I think, is the next required step to be able to actually then articulate what we might believe to be a shared set of political standards for how we think that private actors ought to behave when they're governing the lives of participants. I could talk a little bit more about different methods, but I'll leave that to question time, and I'm happy to take other questions after the last speaker. Thank you.
I'll try that. How's that? Not loud enough? Nope. We're going to have to try the wireless ones. I don't think the cable stretches anymore. Or we'll just do that. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for inviting me. This was sort of a last-minute invitation, but I'm very pleased that I was able to make it. My work online is an extended abstract that should be considered a work in progress. My name is Michael Dick, and this research that I'm about to present in a very brief form relates to my dissertation project on the modernization of Canada's Copyright Act and the various historical and technological issues inherent in both public policy writ large and the policymaking process, consultations, and so forth relevant to this particular exercise in policy reform. So I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in information studies with a background in communication theory, cultural studies, and media studies, as well as industry experience in the same. And I first became interested in issues of internet governance while researching my MA thesis on the history of the semantic web and Web 2.0 in the context of technical standard setting. I was interested then, as I still am now, in how this takes on a de facto form of governance and how it interacts with more manifest forms of governance and regulation. And intellectual property, and especially in my case copyright, actually has a lot in common with that. And I want to suggest to you today, as part of this panel, that IP, intellectual property policy, IP policy, and internet governance are actually interrelated issues. And I want to try and demonstrate that by offering a few key insights into a case study pertaining to Canada's new copyright regime. I appreciate that this is a matter of more local concern, so you may be wondering what it has to do with more international questions of global internet governance that we're tackling at an event like this. And this actually brings me to my first key point, something that's probably obvious, but that I had to, for the sake of academic rigor, confirm through document analysis of over a decade's worth of policymaking materials that brought us to a particular piece of legislation known as Bill C-11 in Canada. It was brought into law in 2012 and introduced several new economic rights into the copyright regime. And this important point that's brought into that is the fact that WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, actually played a very direct role in a national level policymaking and now governance process. Much of the discourse on copyright reform that's dominated the policy landscape in WIPO signatory countries over the past 2 decades has been shaped by 2 WIPO treaties known as the WIPO Internet Treaties, which were adopted in 1996 across the various member states. Now, countries like the US adopted these treaties relatively quickly, for example, with the implementation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, but it would take Canada until 2012 to do the same, notably due to ongoing debates over the key tenets of the bill, and also due to a myriad of political issues, governments rising and falling, etc. What's interesting here is that the bills were basically adopted piecemeal at the insistence of various industry lobby groups and to the consternation of copyright activists and user groups. The federal government promised widespread consultation as part of a quote-unquote balanced copyright initiative, but to this day, the extent to which this was actually balanced remains the subject of debate. My particular interest is in the implementation of a new copyright known as the Making Available Right, or MAR, Essentially, this right was developed to bring copyright into the internet age by allowing rights holders to restrict the making available of content on, for example, a server, versus controlling the act of downloading or streaming or some other form of exploitation of that content over the server per se. So in the Canadian context, the recording industry lobbied very heavily for this right so that they could protect against file sharing and what they viewed as piracy. The thinking being that they could hold people responsible for copyright infringement merely for uploading content to a server, regardless of what end users actually do with that content and whether or not that usage proved to be infringement. Of course, that's a complex issue that would normally need to be addressed through the courts, as we know. Alternatively, various performers' rights organizations and copyright collectives on the other side of the story could monetize the act of making content available by going to the Copyright Board of Canada, which is our economic regulatory body for copyright, and pushing for a certified tariff that would require uploaders of files to pay royalties simply for their actions of doing that. I'm happy to talk more about the national level specifics with you separately, but given the nature of this forum, I wanted to make this point that a supranational policy-making body effectively dictated national level implementation of its treaties, though I don't believe that's exactly what they set out to do. To be clear, my criticism here is with the Canadian copyright monetization process and not necessarily with WIPO. Though I think understanding how rights like the MAR found their way into the WIPO Internet treaties is also a subject that's very much worthy of discussion. So why did Canada do what it did? Well, arguably due to the result of lobbying efforts from industry, but also due to the perception that it had to meet the requirements of other international trade agreements concerning piracy and digital intellectual property. The US, in comparison, never implemented a MAR, as they felt the existing right of communication to the public within their IP regime covered potentially infringing usage of content. Although they're now revisiting this decision, I think this is an important distinction to make, in that there were indeed other options. So now that we have this in mind, I want to make my second and final point today in order to clearly bring this into the space of internet governance and the legal challenges that are inherent within it. And this is really a provocation as well that I hope we can unpack a bit further in this panel, especially around this point about looking at this in practice, because I think it gets to the heart of technology neutrality, which I dare say is something that concerns all of us here, both on the panel and in the room. I suggest in my work, I think above all else, that the implementation of new rights like the MAR, without fully understanding or studying their implications, that is to do it just because WIPO says so, for lack of a better way to put it, is obviously problematic. Of course, it's not just WIPO. Advisory bodies like the IHAC, or IHAC, the Information Highway Advisory Council in Canada, were recommending changes to the IP regime that better protected the rights of content creators in the digital age. And while there's no doubt in my mind that this side of the equation had good intentions, and while protecting the rights of content creators is indeed an important effort, this doesn't reflect the reality of today's copyright climate in the Canadian landscape. So moreover, I develop in my work that the argument that this takes on a form of de facto internet regulation, and this is in spite of the fact that the Canadian Broadcast and Telecom Regulator, the CRTC, has opted for a position of forbearance regarding digital networks as early as 1999, and they've restated that point several times since. Copyright regulating the internet, really? Well, it's not so far-fetched when you consider that this has already been addressed to some extent through, for example, Lessig's notion of regulability and his criticism of DMCA takedown notices. But this is a case where a right implemented in the context of a country's civil law framework effectively adopts a guilty until proven innocent approach to sharing content through online networks by way of the server. Similar phenomena in the offline and/or analog space has already been litigated. Key Supreme Court of Canada decisions have already held that making content available, or more accurately, the means of making that content available, is not a prima facie infringement of copyright laws. For example, in 2004, the court found that one of the colleges that regulates lawyers in Canada was not liable to a group of publishers for quote-unquote copyright infringement merely by making research services available to their members. Here, quite literally, their act of placing a photocopier in the library, making available the means to potentially infringe a publisher's copyright, was seen as fair dealing, or what other countries call fair use, which is a substantive defense against copyright infringement. So let's extrapolate this in closing into the digital online network space. If the jurisprudence already holds that making the means to make content available isn't infringement, what's the merit in basically regulating the use of content online through rights like the MAR, the MAR? How does this level of restriction conflict with the open internet and web that we want? How does it conflict with the notion of technology neutrality and that rights should remain focused on the use of the object rather than controlling access to it? These are main important questions that I argue we must address. They should have been more thoroughly taken up before countries like Canada implemented the WIPO treaties wholesale at the insistence of industry groups who were ostensibly trying to use rights like the MAR as an insurance policy, if you will, through which online file sharing could be controlled, even in cases where the courts and other bodies found that certain ways in which content is communicated to the public via internet-enabled or facilitated means were not necessarily controllable nor compensable. And most importantly, we must consider the elephant in the room here, that this is a form of policy, regulation, or whatever we want to call it, that was partially devised because copyright regimes could not keep up with the means that we have to reproduce, share, stream, and otherwise distribute content in the rapid new ways that the online environment affords. So will this change with new rights like the MAR? I think not. And I think the chilling effect this could have on the balanced approaches to online governance and copyright that assuredly most of us in this room ultimately want makes them dangerous. And I look forward in that spirit to continuing this conversation with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentations. It was really great. I have some questions, but I will keep it for the second round. And I would like to open the floor for comments, questions. We also have remote participation. Maybe we have some questions from the remote participants? Not yet. Okay. So the floor is open. Please raise your hand up.
Hi, this is Rachel Pollack. Thank you to all the presenters, very interesting research. I had a question regarding the first presentation about the normative frameworks within intermediaries. And I don't now remember if you mentioned it or if I just saw in your paper that you intend to do interviews and also ethnographic research. Have you already started that process, and has Google been open to accepting an ethnographic researcher? Because my experience from what I've read and also personal experience is that it can be quite closed about their internal processes. So I would be curious about how you intend to tackle that.
You're quite right. It's a mixture of methods. So we have some 3 levels of 3 phases of interviews, but we also want to do as a icing on the cake these ethnographic thing. We have not settled that so far, but we had some informal talks so far. I think it might be in the interest of the organization to become a little more transparent as regards that. But the project is designed in a way that we get some meaningful results even if we cannot have these ethnographic approach. What would be great, there are some, under the German legal education, for example, you have the so-called Referendariat, and Google takes those people on board, and there might be one approach to say that there is one of those scientific junior researchers that have their referendariat there and then make use of that for their ethnographic research. But of course, you hit a very important point there. But we are quite sure that it's possible to get some valid information without that.
Maybe a meta comment to this question. What we found really interesting when thinking about and trying to organize this project is how the organizations are dealing with their boundary work that is going on. Do they close up or do they open for the public? And especially the right to be forgotten is an interesting case. So they founded a more or less public extra organizational expert committee on the right to be forgotten in Europe. And from our point of view, this is also a process that could be seen as the organization opens for the public, because the normative structures transfer this power to inside the organization. So the organization is forced to develop norm sets. These norm sets are related to public interests, and this is forcing the organizations to open for public discussion. And we hope that our project could work on that too.
I just want to add to this how much of a major challenge this is right now. For something that a lot of people think is quite important, it's incredibly difficult to get good information about how private decisions are made. And I've supervised a few PhD projects. We've been trying to get access for many years, and we're unable to really get access to the major companies. We're able to get better access to some of the smaller groups. Worldwide, I think only a handful of researchers have ever really got really good qualitative data out of large-scale intermediaries about decision-making processes. So I'd love to hear how you go with that. Then for me, as a question of research design, there are implications from this as well. We've, to an extent, given up on some of the internal qualitative approaches because it's been so difficult to carry out that we've resorted now to try to develop new black box testing methods, essentially, to watch from the public outputs of governance systems, thinking about what material is removed, to be able to develop monitoring systems, I guess. So particularly for content moderation or for DMCA takedowns, for example, where we're unable to get that information directly from providers, there are opportunities for the use of digital methods to try to reverse engineer the internal processes. I probably should also mention that some intermediaries are much better at providing this information than others. You have to acknowledge that Google and Twitter, particularly in their transparency data, are quite good at reporting at least on external requests by governments. So part of that is a strategy of resistance, particularly to the European courts, I think. But it does provide a lot of information for researchers that's not available for some of the other platforms. So I think this politics of transparency is also really interesting as it starts to evolve, and people need to increasingly, I think that in order to maintain that descriptive legitimacy that I spoke about, the belief amongst participants that the platform is governing in a way that is legitimate, then increasingly I think we'll see more disclosures about that, which would be useful for us as researchers to be able to dig into what's going on. But it's a tough methodological challenge.
Yes, while we're on methodology, access is always has to be negotiated and maintained, particularly for private situations. If you were to gain access in some respect, what would it actually involve, this ethnographic approach? Speaking as someone who has done extensive ethnographic work, could you just outline, if it were possible, what you would be actually doing and over how much time? And in which degree of immersion, if it were possible. And perhaps if you had any comments on that too. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. If might start with referring to Nick for one or two sentences. I think in this case, it might be a really good test case for Google here, because as far as I hear from the data protection officers in Germany, they are quite content with what they are doing. So the norms they are evolving there are more or less in line with the data protection regulation as the data protection officer sees them. So it's not a kind of investigative research to undig something which might be harmful for the organization, but it's more to really understand how the norms are developed, and so might be different to other internal investigations that you have with a company. But coming back to your, of course, very important question, we thought about that a lot, and we want to build about on the research that our colleague Malte Ziewitz did, and he is the only one I know already did ethnographic studies on intermediaries, on online intermediaries, and so we want to build on what he did. We are not sure that we can do it as long as he did it. I'm not sure, it was several months, nearly a year I think he was in this one organization in Great Britain, but the minimum we want to have is about 4 months, and more would be better, of course. The focus is, we have not laid out it in detail, we must confess, it's in the state that we have this research outline, but what we really want to understand is to map the cases when a new decision has to be taken, there is a discussion, internal discussion about how the rules that are in place have to be applied or modified. And when this modification takes place, then we find it extremely interesting to see what are the intellectual sources, the normative sources that are used. And we have heard already that German law plays a role, because a lot of cases come from Germany. Of course, the tradition, the American tradition plays a role. There might be some other bodies of rules that play a role. And we are especially interested in to see how a new set of rules emerges inside an organization, making use of external normative sets of rules. And that's the main focus of this research. That is what we try to understand.
I guess I would just say that I'm not an ethnographer, and I know that there are ethnographers in the room who've done quite a lot of work in to understand governance practices. My research design is primarily around comparative analysis of qualitative case studies, looking particularly to try to understand the influence of different regulatory frameworks and different external stakeholders on internal governance processes. So, for example, trying to understand how a formalized notice and takedown scheme under copyright might lead to one type of decision making, or a slightly different scheme under the right to be forgotten might lead to a slightly different type of or process for decision making, and then comparing that with the unofficial soft law, co-regulatory and simply pressure from civil society on intermediaries to govern their networks in particular ways under different bodies of law, or sometimes not under legal regimes at all. So thinking about hate speech, for example, and vilification, some of which are often dealt with completely outside of legal frameworks, and then trying to use that to compare across intermediaries and across different areas of regulation.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. It's really interesting. As this is an academic workshop, I'm being a little academic here, about methodology. All of you appear to be doing what some schools of thought would call archaeological work. You're reconstructing, drawing inferences from sometimes a decade of documentation, formal and informal. And this is an important point to make, is that now that these spaces have been around that many years, the official and unofficial record is now available. And in the case of Patricia, your work is perhaps flagging the next set of archives, formal and informal, that will be perhaps discovered and reconstructed. My question is, once again, where do the human actors figure in this archaeological approach to the document from a legal point of view analysis? I'm not saying they should figure, but they seem to be implicitly part of your frameworks. Do you see yourselves, or have you done interviews to check? If you could just extrapolate a little bit on that to help all the students and researchers in the room. And Patricia, perhaps if you have anything to note on the methodology for your work, because it's a fascinating new area. Thank you. Oh, by the way, Marianne Franklin, for the record. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. Very rude of me.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Addressing the issue of the methodology, which is the one you pointed out. Yeah. No, yes, thank you. Well, first, this paper is basically a legal work. As you can see, the main subject of data that I use was the set of deliberations which outcome was UNCLOS. You see, this convention is the result of 100 years of negotiations, 3 conventions by the UN, 1 by the League of Nations, and 2,000 years of state practice. Because 2,000 years is obviously too much, and because the League of Nations no longer exists, I based my analysis on the deliberations of the last convention. From the 3 that the UN conducted, only the last one, which took about 20 years, so it's actually an extensive work. What I basically did was taking what the literature review has mentioned so far about the application of UNCLOS. In concrete, I think there are 3 points of analysis. One argues about the application of UNCLOS to the internet packets. I believe that is going to create more confusion than helps, but it's still part of the academic work. Somebody else, another academic, argues about using the rules to fight against piracy from UNCLOS into the piracy into the cyberspace. And finally is the military approach that I just mentioned. Tackling these 3 aspects that the literature has covered so far is that I came up with the implications of the application of the hot pursuit in concrete. This is a mechanism to fight against illegal activities. But the main characteristic of the hot pursuit is that no matter what happens, and this is the way the ICJ and the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea acknowledge it as well, is no matter what the crime is, no matter what's going on, no matter even the gravity of the crime, once the sovereignty of a third nation state starts, the other one has to stop. That does not mean that one nation state cannot access the data that is in another nation state. This is to take him back to the case to the cyberspace. But you have to request it through the traditional mechanisms of the negotiation between nation states, right? In the concrete case of the United States is the use of the MLATs, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties, and all the bureaucracy that is behind them.
It's Michael Dick again. Thanks very much for the question. It's an excellent one, and I really like the way you described that as archaeological work. I think that, especially in my case, looking at the reform of an intellectual property regime, of a copyright policy-making process, a lot of this material obviously is publicly available in the sense that it's part of a legislative process and part of a policy cycle, if you will. So in my case, it was basically looking at and sort of mining, doing a deep dive, in some cases using coding structures, in some cases using more grounded theory-oriented methods, looking at basically 2 main consultation phases that were run over the course of this approximately 10-year period. And there was sort of a second consultation phase launched because of, as I said, governments rising and falling over that time. And there's in that framework hundreds and hundreds of stakeholder submissions from various actors. Actors are very important, obviously. We've been talking a lot about that in this panel, I think. One of the things I wanted to say, though, just as a comment on methods, is that it's not that you can't take that material at its face value. It's that I think we have to put this into the broader understanding of agenda setting, and I think that, and I really think this is the case across many of the topics we discussed today, but I can certainly say in the case of copyright, having been involved in the capacity of helping prepare expert witness testimony in court, in copyright board hearings, and actually sort of being a part of that process myself, decision makers are basically alive to whatever you ask them to be alive to, and they're alive to whatever their broader agenda and their governors are basically sending down to them. So for every person who's arguing that it should be this way with, let's say, a copyright regime, there's an equal and opposite reaction on the other side and someone saying something different. For every Metallica that was wanting to sue people for uploading files on Napster, there were artists who were saying, this is actually good for our image and our brand. We need to make a living, but this is actually helping us to some extent because it's promoting us, it's free publicity. So you're always going to find actors with sort of opposite perspectives on many of these issues. I think the challenge from a methodological standpoint is trying to weigh that as more of an objective scholar, or trying to be an objective scholar at least, and trying to suss out that agenda or suss out the motivation in that without making sort of drastically off-base conclusions. And this is, I think, the issue sometimes with doing things like interviews to triangulate that, is that you still face the same agenda setting because people who made certain decisions at the time, because they were part of an industry lobby group, for example, in many cases they're going to back that up, either because they're still working in that field or because nobody likes to basically say, I was wrong, oops. Although actually just about a week ago, a month or two ago, Michael Geist, who's a very prominent Canadian public intellectual, a lawyer who's a copyright or a copyleft activist working in this space, basically posited that some of the folks who were lobbying as part of the music industry efforts in Canada for this new making available right and for the sort of wholesale adoption of the WIPO treaties, as I mentioned earlier, they were basically contradicting themselves when he analyzed and compared a couple of their speeches to various economic clubs. He basically was trying to point out the fact that without actually admitting it, they were basically all of a sudden saying, oops, this maybe wasn't the best approach. We should have thought something through a little bit more. So you actually have to be a bit of a sleuth and a bit of a detective, I think, when you do some of this work sometimes, because people will seldom come out and say, on second thought, it doesn't happen that often in my experience.
Maybe just a short word how we identify the actors that are relevant for us. For the record, Markus Oermann speaking. We do media discourse analysis as a starting point that covers the right to be forgotten decision. We have some relevant actors in this procedure going on there already, and then we approach the actors that are named in the media discourse as relevant in the first phase of guided interviews, and then we ask for what are the actors that you find are also relevant that we didn't cover in our first wave of interviews, and then we do a second interview wave. But it's always a hard task to bridge the levels of individual, collective actors and how they interact and how they reconstruct themselves and the other actors in the field, in the discourse. So we always have to take a starting point, and our starting point is the media discourse, and then second wave analysis.
Thanks for the question. I think it's such an important one to think about. I think there's also no simple answer to that, which I think may have been part of your motivation in asking the question. But there's different approaches for different tasks that we particularly employ. And I guess at some level, some of the work that I was talking about today, most recently, we are abstracting away from the individual humans in the system. And that is, it's a choice that we've made in that research design, and it's a weakness in the ability to draw conclusions about what's going on inside in the everyday practice of governing a system. So I really like to see the rich ethnographic work of people who are able to get in there and document that. We do see roles of particular actors come out from a lot of the literature, a lot of the grey literature work too, particularly as you see how much of the ideology, how much of the framing in which in the way in which the platforms understand their role in governance and are willing to conceptualize their work and willing to engage with external stakeholders really changes with changes in CEOs, changes with other really influential people within an organization. And you do see that come out quite clearly sometimes from the textual analysis. At other times, we're really interested in how people participate. So thinking now about the subjects of governance here, how people participate within different governance regimes. So I like frameworks like Mara's work on material participation, for example, which we've adopted to think about how people experience the day-to-day acts of governance in different networks. And we can collect traces of that, particularly digital traces through different social media analysis and of different platforms to understand a little bit more about the contest, particularly about legitimacy in governance. But it's a fascinating area, and there's many, many methods to choose from.
Hi, I'm Alison Gilward from Research ICT Africa. My question is to Nick on the legitimacy issues, but I suppose it also relates to Marcus's group, the collective paper. I think a lot of the discussions that are happening around legitimacy and making the governance systems work better, etc. We continue to do, we apply the same normative frame to it, which doesn't really address those who are feeling marginalized or excluded or exclude themselves from these processes because they don't accept those normative frames. So I suppose there's a sense of which, the work that we're doing continues to perfect the system or improve the system for those who are inside, but doesn't really engage with how we get those who don't support, for example, multi-stakeholder governance on board. So I think the idea of holding private companies as key stakeholders and decision makers accountable is potentially a way of bringing those people, not necessarily who have no normative frames that you can draw on at all. So, the sort of administrative justice systems that you explain, rule of law, etc., are not things that you can appeal to, and people therefore don't want to be participating in these multi-stakeholder systems. But some that are sort of standing on the cusp of things, but still feel that states should be holders of this kind of governance, etc. That perhaps at least if you could be arguing that these private platforms, private companies, etc., have some obligation around transparency and accountability, you might be able to draw in some people who are on the margins of this, large numbers of countries who don't see any legitimacy and credibility within the system. So the question then is, what is the mechanism to oblige public platform, private companies, platforms, etc., to make those disclosures, to be transparent in this sort of unregulated environment? And how could you link that possibly to sort of broader disclosure and sort of developmental issues? So, for example, public data or big data or something like that, so that it's not something sort of discretionary that's given out to developing world governments in order for certain platforms to operate or something, but that there's a kind of quid pro quo as part of this transparency. So I'm just wondering if there's some way of actually making it happen.
Thanks. That's such a terrific question, really important one. I think the short answer is that I agree with you completely, that the first step is transparency, and that's where we as civil society, as people who are concerned about governance, need to be applying the most pressure, I think. That before we can even have any of these conversations about the massive contested political values that are at stake, the substantive rights and other values that are at stake here, we need to understand better what exactly is happening. And only then can we really have a more political discussion about what should we expect. The slightly longer answer, I guess, is one of the things that brought me to this framework in particular is that the idea, or I guess the recognition that when we have some of these debates with people who are not necessarily in this room or in rooms like it, that it's very hard to have a shared language through which to talk about these issues. So I'm working with some colleagues who are scholars with a lot of experience in domestic violence, for example. And recently I think that the dialogue between internet governance people, and particularly people from the tech sector, has become much better at engaging with the substantive concerns of victims of domestic violence or abuse. That's happened relatively recently, and through a lot of work by a lot of organizations who have had to, in a sense, break into this type of conversation. And the key point, I think, for me is if we're able to articulate this in a set of in a language that we can at least agree on about how we're describing governance and the issues at stake, then I think that's a necessary precondition for actually enabling those further conversations. I think the first, one of the papers in the first session really showed how close some of these debates are, and I think that issue of both transparency and a shared language is something we absolutely have to address to broaden out these substantive concerns.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's really a fascinating discussion we have there. And I think what we can see, we had a discussion on that a couple of weeks ago in Paris at this inter-jurisdiction conference. And there was this point, how to include people who are normally not included into the conversation, one major issue. And as regards transparency, the feeling there was that when it comes to some of the intermediaries, there is already transparency about at least the action of others, the states, for example. But there is some room for improvement when it comes to explaining redress policies, for example. So one delegate there said, if you do not know somebody in the institution, in the organization, or in a pressure group, then you are lost. You do not really have the opportunity there. And I think that's one basket of questions when it comes to transparency. But nevertheless, the main feeling was that it's mainly the states that lack transparency here, and there should be some good practices as regards transparency, as regards state actions in this field. And maybe we will come up with a kind of pilot project there with one or two countries. At least we have the intention to do so. So that's, I think, one aspect. Another aspect I wanted to raise, and that comes back to the initial point of Nick, is that the questions we are dealing with are extremely fundamental when it comes to legitimacy and rule of law and aspects like that. Because as lawyers, we normally have this simple binary code. We say that it's the state, a state actor, a state action, then it has to be a process of legitimization, rule of law applies, fundamental rights apply, or not, then not. And then maybe the state is responsible for making others accountable, but they are not accountable as such. And I think this very fundamental thing, is this concept still valid? Can we work with that when it comes to online platforms? Or do we have to think about hybrid concepts where you look at specific actions and look at specific decisions and see whether they are at least de facto binding for people, and then have a conversation about rule of law and things like that. It's extremely challenging. And I have the honor to work with a Council of Europe a group where we want to come up with suggestions on human rights standards for states and intermediaries. And when we come to intermediaries, we have to answer the question, what is the link here? Can we really, as Council of Europe, based on Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, make some suggestions that we believe the actors are bound by Article 10, or what is actually the concept? I think we have to put some thoughts and effort in research here. I'm looking forward to work together on that. It seems to be very much links, very many links between our research there.
Any other questions? maybe we have someone in remote participation? Not yet, okay. Michael, I have a question for you. One of the hot topics regarding copyright and policies, it's the content blocking, including notes and takedown of domain name systems. In Brazil, for instance, we have a very strong discussion at the Congress regarding some congressmen, they want to make some change in the Marco Civil, which is the civil rights framework that we passed into law 2 years ago. And for example, the copyright holders, and especially the Motion Pictures Association of America, they are lobbying in the Congress to modify Marco Civil to impose blocking on content and on domain name systems. And I would like to know your views, or if you could make some comments on that, especially on the impact of that kind of approach on net neutrality and freedom of speech.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that countries like Brazil, I think, in my view, and probably your view as well, have a much saner approach to intellectual property that I think better balances the public interest. When you think about the regulation of patents and pharmaceuticals and drugs, I mean, Brazil, I think, is a very positive example of how to do this in such a way that it actually is both beneficial to those who are trying to make their living, but also not doing so at the expense of broader social issues. I think that on the whole, things like takedown notices and things that operate in that vein are, to some degree, less a violation of free expression, because that's a very relative concept that tends to shift depending on what country you're in. Some countries like Canada have very clear limits to that. Some like the US don't, and it's up to courts to basically determine that right from the get-go. So I think it's less about that. It's more about issues of liability. And the takedown notice, as it's envisioned in the DMCA and also as the new Canadian copyright regime and many other countries basically see it, they look at it as a way for ISPs in particular to avoid liability. It's sort of a safe harbor provision that, you know, look, we passed on this notice, then our hands are basically clean. So it's a way to sort of disintermediate the intermediary and basically pass on the responsibility for dealing with the content to the actual end user. The benefit to that, if there is a benefit, is that, you know, in theory, yes, you can sue the 12-year-old kid who posted the file, and indeed the RIAA in the US did just that. The flip side to that, though, is that they don't typically have a lot of money. So you can obviously try, but I think there was enough outrage with that sort of case that I'm not expecting to see as much of that personally. But you still hear cases of that, and you hear, you know, friends of mine or maybe yours who are getting these random letters from, you know, MPAA or these other, you know, random studios. You've been downloading too much, says the ISP, of this person's content. Go and take it down, otherwise you're going to face legal consequences. I mean, in some respects, that's totally ridiculous in the sense that there really is not a measurable harm economically, I would argue at least, being done. So to me, it's less about the issue of free expression, because many countries recognize limits to that. It's about trying to actually understand where the harm is actually being done. And that's why I'm concerned about things like a making available right and other things that operate sort of in that vein, is that you've basically come to a conclusion that this is problematic before it even necessarily has become problematic. I mean, typically to win an infringement case, you're supposed to have to prove, you know, there were actual damages. So look at these damages, and now let's get an order against this, or let's find someone, or what have you. This is a case where arguably a legislative framework basically can say right from the get-go, you know, no, someone has exercised this right. You can't do this. They've said this is infringement, or you have to pay a royalty just for doing this, right? This very action of putting it out there, regardless of what actually happens to it. So that I think concerns me more I mean, there's a time and a place for issues of infringement or a takedown notice, and I think that's, in some respects, a bit of a separate conversation, a good conversation, but a bit of a separate one. It's this sort of before-the-fact policing of the sharing of content that I think has a crucial role in the internet governance community, because it's basically de facto regulating not just speech and expression, but just what we can and cannot do with a server or a medium or something like that. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think it's an important perspective.
Any other questions or comments? No?
If I might, just ask a question of Marcus and Wolfgang. I guess it's another methodological question. I'm interested in how you deal with questions of both scale and scope. By scale, the massive number of decisions that are made here, and scope about how you articulate or delineate the boundaries of these governance systems. I guess the question is, can you understand governance in the right to be forgotten without understanding conflicts over taxation policy? And how do we then start to look at across these different issues of concern that involve many of the same actors, but also some new actors, but very, very different regulatory frameworks? So I just wonder whether you can reflect a little bit on how you're approaching that, or how you think we might start to do that in the future.
Marcus Ehrman, to your question regarding the scope and how we can differentiate between different discourses of governance or different governance issues, we try to apply this thematic framework, this frame of relevance, and we try to figure out how the actors in our figurations themselves describe the issues of governance, how they themselves differentiate between different issues or spheres of governance, different thematic frames in which they construct the norms that are relevant for the cases. And regarding the large number of cases, that's right. We are faced with numbers in the 100,000s or millions, but we try to get the abstract view on it by combining different methods, looking at it from the structural level, and just asking for what are the cases when norms where there are frictions in the application of norms, what are the cases that we can identify where the application is not so easy. And these are the ones that are relevant for us, because we are thinking that there are critical moments when governance structures develop further, and these critical moments are the ones that we have to identify. And we try to do this, but it's a hard task to do it.
Maybe just two more thoughts. One, just reflecting what Marcus said, norms are there to deal with great numbers. And so we are not interested in how the standard cases deal with, but we are interested in when there are changes of those rules. And what can we see when we analyze this tipping point, that there is a new rule or an amendment of a rule. So that's one thing to deal with scale. And scope, you're of course right, but I think we want to focus very narrowly on understanding specific backgrounds of how norms evolve. And we do not see the whole picture. We see not all the motives of the actors, for example. And you are quite right, there are intersections between different sections of law, for example. And of course, you can understand the action of some European politicians only against the background that they see that the money is flowing to the US. And they talk about liability and other things, but that's what they have in mind. But I think that's a different research question, an important one as well. And we want to engage in research around that in the next couple of years as well, but this is more focused here.
Any other comments? Sorry, any other comments? Questions? No? So I think we can, moving forward to the close. maybe if you want to speak a little bit the next step about your research. What's the next step? If you could briefly explain what's the next step and how this community can contribute.
For me, the next step is both easy and incredibly difficult, which is to understand these questions at all of these different levels that we've been talking about, and working with as many different people who trying to develop collaborations between all of us that have these shared research interests, so that we can start to understand and take on this massive task at understanding these questions at the different levels.
Well, I think the next step is, well, now that we are seeing kind of a reborn of the nation states after the Brexit and the last electoral results in the United States, I kind of think these regimes so passionately call for these institutions, these treaties that are trying to turn back the power from the stakeholders to the governments. I think I'm going to focus, and I hope to find some possibilities of sharing research about other potential agreements that can also be called by nation states, whether they are related to the air or to the land itself. Right?
Yeah, for us, the natural next step is to do the project or to process it further. And what, in my opinion, is the next step in thinking about all these points that we tipped on today is to do more analysis on the different power structures in the field. So what is the difference between state power and exercise of state power and the exercise of power by private actors? And I think that's the point that all the papers have in common. And we could reformulate this question: what are the public values here in stake, and when does private decisions become a public issue? That's, from my point of view, the natural next step in thinking about all these questions.
Yeah, what we additionally do is coming from these four-factor model of governance research, not only to study the doing aspect, what we do in this project, where we try to see how the procedure works of norm making, but we also want to better understand the interaction between the social and technical norm setting. And we have just started a cooperation with our Department of Software Engineering, where we have a bigger 3-year project on what we call information technology governance, or always mix it up, but I think that's it. And what we try to do there is to have a common understanding about terms and concepts, which is not so easy, of course, in a multidisciplinary environment. And we even want to come up with some technical solution, if possible, for privacy or other issues when we form these think tanks with different perspectives on internet governance. But again, it's started a week ago, so next year results, I guess.
It's Michael Dick again for our online viewers. I guess I get the last word. Ooh, that's scary. Well, I mean, let me say a couple things. One, on my end, in terms of my work, it's a question of continuing to write and research and hopefully turning more of this into active sort of policy interventions. And I think that on that point, one thing that I would raise sort of in summation of a lot of the things we've heard today is that I think there's a really central theme here and a central question of who gets to govern and how does the process sort of legitimize itself throughout the various actors and the various things that are going on. And we've heard that from a multitude of perspectives. I think certainly that, you know, from my perspective looking at intellectual property policy, this is, to me, internet governance. Just like a few years ago I was looking at technical standard setting as internet governance in the sense of, you know, why does the W3C basically call the shots? And I think this is the same sort of thing in the sense that legal frameworks that obviously have their purpose are starting to encroach upon how we conceive of the online environment writ large. And that, to me, is alarming. And that, to me, is something that I think we all need to be in tune with as we continue to do our work that ultimately will hopefully shape policy in its various forms, to always keep in mind that central construct, or that central question of who gets to write the rules, and why is it that some actors in the broad political economy of the internet and the web, et cetera, and digital networks more generally, how is it that some voices are sort of rising to the top, whereas non-users or those who are maybe not being heard as much are being left out?
Okay, it's working? Yeah, this one is working. Okay, so we are closing this session. We have 30 minutes extra for the lunch break. And I'd like to remember that we should come back at 12:30 for the next session. It will be titled Actors and Policies in Internet Governance. And I would like also to recall that all the papers are available online at the GigaNet website. So thank you very much for all of you. Congratulations again for your very interesting research. Congratulations for your presentation. And see you all after the lunch. And have a good lunch for everyone. Thank you.